A Pluralist Order by Common Man. Chapter 4: Successful Models of Greater Local Autonomy. Some facts are self-evident. It should be obvious that if Barcelona were to secede, the one effect would be a decrease in the gross domestic product of Spain. It would also be a detriment economically for the United Kingdom if it were to lose Scotland, Canada if it were to lose either Alberta or Quebec, the United States if it lost California or Texas, China if it lost again Hong Kong or Macau. Thus, there is a nationalistic impetus to crush secession movements. Are there examples, however, where greater local autonomy and governance has in fact strengthened the local economy? Is it possible that over time this greater local autonomy could in return strengthen the former nation that was initially harmed by the secession? In a world full of secession movements, from the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, to Scotland from the United Kingdom, and even on to the City of London from Greater London, the answers to these two questions have more profound implications than whether or not the movements themselves are successful. Ultimately, nothing matters more than what is at the core of this desire for greater local autonomy. Why do the people want greater local sovereignty? As already stated, the answer lies in each human being's desire to govern itself. The problem today lies in the fact that governments, even those of democratic republics, have become so large and disconnected from the individual as to render inert the spirit of popular sovereignty. The people no longer believe in a government of, by, and for them. Instead, they see a government of crony capitalists, by crooked politicians, and for special interest groups. This disconnect, at least in the United States, can be solved. It will be done by strengthening representation at the local level and allowing greater local autonomy. As the United States wrestles with its own proportional representation framework, perhaps it can become again a model of governance for the rest of the world. In order to do so, we must get back to our roots. We must recall what was once done properly so that we can build that elusive city upon a hill. Let us turn back the clock and look at the time of our founding. James Madison, through a series of compromises, was able to help set the number of legislators in the United States House of Representatives to 1 per every 30,000 citizens. That's Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution. This number is somewhat disingenuous because only white men over the age of 21 were citizens. Yet even before the fact had changed by enfranchising women and other races, the number of representatives to citizens was greatly diminished. In 1911, Congress passed the Apportionment Act, which capped the number of representatives in the U.S. House at 435. This meant one representative for every 212,000 voters, still white men over 21, a huge degradation in popular sovereignty in just over 100 years. By 2010, With representation extended to all men and women over the age of 18, there is only one representative for every 710,000 Americans. One representative now has over 20 times more constituents than our founding fathers ever intended. We each get 1/20th the representation that was intended for citizens of the United States. I do not propose we increase the size of the House of Representatives to a number of more than 10,000 representatives in order to bring this inequity back into balance. However, I am suggesting that we must find a solution to the problem and put forward the following as a humble suggestion. For our look at the present and how to deal with the problem of apportionment, let us look to a very specific place, Jasper, Alabama. This is the small town where I spent most of my childhood. Here we can seek to understand how this lack of representation has impacted the average American. How does it make them feel about their government? Can this lack of representation be solved through compromise to existing proposals? Jasper is a small town with a population of around 15,000 people. It is the county seat of Walker County, with its population of around 70,000. Throughout most of the county's history, the backbone of its economy has been coal mining. The county itself is located in the northwestern part of the central portion of the state of Alabama, with its population nearing 5 million people. The state makes up less than 3% of the total population of the United States. There are less people in the entire state than there are in cities like New York or Los Angeles. To make matters worse, the state of Alabama is considered destitute by most outside observers. While this assumption is largely bigoted and unfair to the great people of the state, there is a lot of statistical evidence to back up these opinions. Whether one is measuring economics, health, educational standards, or cultural activity values, Alabama will often come in last or near the bottom compared to the other 50 states. Based on these facts alone, do you believe the average citizen of Jasper feels represented in Washington, D.C.? Are any of them truly represented in our nation's capital? All of Walker County makes up less than 10% of the population within their congressional district. Jasper itself makes up just over 2%. Therefore, any citizen in the small town where I grew up is worth 1/7500th of 1% of their congressman's time. Even if our congressman never slept, there are only 8,760 hours per year. Further, like so many others in my hometown, I'm economically inconsequential. How many of my townsfolk are able to truly speak with our representative in any impactful manner? I suggest that the answer is very, very few. Far too few. Perhaps that number cannot be brought down to a more impactful level based upon the current circumstances. If it cannot, the move for more and more local autonomy will continue. For people to believe in popular sovereignty again, they must have a part in their government. A viable alternative is increasing the number of representatives in local governance. For instance, if the town of Jasper increased the size of its city council to a total of 15, there would be one representative per 1,000 people. This would make it much more likely for the average citizen to know his local representative. Take that number to 150 representatives on the city council, and it is now one representative per 100 citizens. That means you likely go to church every week or work every day with yours. The people could then trust their local representative would voice their interest in their interactions with state and national representatives. These interests would not always win, but at least they would be represented. In the open democracy of the United States, 1,000 different cities could try 1,000 different solutions to the problem of apportionment. Eventually, a basic model would emerge from the trials. Yet before the United States becomes the United City-States, are there outside models of successful, independent, or autonomous city-states? What is the model of city governments of the future? Are there core elements on which can base a framework for a model of a successful city-state? Well, have you ever heard of Dubai? How about Singapore? Did you ever wonder why Hong Kong was so economically vibrant long before the rest of mainland China? Why was Venice the richest city of the Middle Ages? How did the city of Rome stretch its peace across the known world? How did Athens, often with no greater population than my own hometown, produce so many great thinkers? Of course, all of these are great city-states, but it is hard to see any other similarities. What are the most important elements to success for any nation? For the answers to this question, I turn to Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. The authors provide a framework for determining a nation's success based on its institutions. As Professor Scott Page of the Santa Fe Institute puts it, Acemoglu and Robinson have created a coherent, if theoretical, framework for successful governance based on limiting extraction, promoting creative destruction, and creating strong political institutions which share power. Therefore, if one is looking for specific answers as to how to create a successful nation, their work is a failure. However, if one is looking for a framework in which to study how nations fail, then this is a perfect source. We all should seek to avoid failure before we seek perfection. The authors themselves suggest their reason for not giving specific instructions by suggesting that a pluralistic approach is necessary. The authors also help establish proper terminology to frame our discourse of the politics of poverty and prosperity. The two key terms to understand are extractive and inclusive, both in regards to institutions, whether economic or political. An extractive economic institution uses the many to give resources to a few elite. A prime example of a purely extractive economic institution would be slavery. Extractive political institutions or systems do the same thing with political power. The best example would be a total dictatorship. An inclusive economic or political institution is the opposite, as it encourages participation for a broad section of the population. Inclusive institutions need the rule of law to secure property rights and a broad distribution of power, thus creating incentives for people to generate economic growth. Eventually, in inclusive systems, a virtuous circle is formed. In a virtuous circle, inclusive economic institutions produce more inclusive political institutions, which in turn produce more inclusive economic institutions ad infinitum. On the other hand, extractive institutions limit the individual's incentive to work, since much of the product of their labor is not enjoyed by them. This creates a vicious circle, where productivity declines and extractive institutions become more powerful. The authors state time and again that a pluralist approach is needed to create successful, inclusive institutions. They offer as guidelines the strong rule of law that values private property, a level playing field, and tolerance of creative destruction. The authors are also very clear on how nations fail. They do so through extractive institutions that do not create incentives needed for people to save, invest, and innovate. Acemoglu and Robinson have ultimately given us a new way of looking at comparative macroeconomics over time and its political influences and consequences. Though it is not stated explicitly, the city-state is an implied model of good governance. The inclusive political and economic environment with its various cultural nuances is at the heart of the success of this model. It is possessed at various levels by Singapore, Dubai, and Hong Kong. If what the world needs is strong governments with broad representation, what else is a better solution than the city-state? The city-state is the only way to limit the number of constituents per representative to a logical level. City-states can provide strong, inclusive local institutions. Can that be all that needs to be done? We give cities autonomy and increase the number of representatives in the local government? Hardly. It is, however, a good place to start. City-states are not necessary or even ideal in a truly rural area, but the principle of limiting the number of voters per representative should be. The geographic districts of the most populous zones for any government representative should always be shrinking, not the voice of the individual in their government. Above all, the supreme principle is popular sovereignty and how to most equitably achieve it in a representative system. There is a need for more than just local autonomy, increasing representation, and strengthening local rule. They are merely a foundation for compromise on which we can all agree. How are these things to be achieved? Can it be done in a pluralistic and inclusive manner? If so, what tools are to be used? I believe a pluralist, inclusive, highly representative government is possible. Not only is it possible, but we already have the tools to create them. The next few chapters outline what these tools are and how to use them, as we seem to have forgotten.